And now we have two items for you from Alan Taylor Shearer's own blog, Alan's Antics. These are both EU related still. The first is entitled, German Minister Says We Shouldn't Discuss Fantasy Proposals for Brexit and Article 50. So what's all that about, Alan?
From newsrepublic.com, German minister says that they shouldn't discuss fantasy proposals for a Brexit scenario. This is a short report from News Republic, but it's very important and very telling because they obviously have decided that Brexit isn't going to make any difference at all if it happens. And I also suspect they've also decided that it's not going to happen. But anyway, Germany's foreign minister said that a British vote to leave the European Union would create a negative dynamic in the remainder of the EU, but that Berlin should not discuss any proposals for dealing with such a scenario. Because, as far as they're concerned, Brexit isn't going to happen. So, whatever we vote, it seems, according to this guy, nothing's going to change. Britain votes on the 23rd of June in a referendum on whether to remain in the EU, and German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said he hoped British voters would decide to stay. Asked if, given the Brexit debate, he saw a need for a new initiative to make Europe strong, and if he had discussed such plans with colleagues, Steinmeier said, "I have no influence on the campaign to prepare for the referendum in Britain. Even if I had plans drawn up in my head, they would have an influence either way on the debate in Britain." He told the Foreign Press Association in Berlin, "Therefore I can only say the decision really lies in Britain. We can't have any influence on that, and we shouldn't have any influence with fantasy proposals about the future of the European Union and what would happen if, and, in particular, what would happen if Britain leaves," he said. "These are all speculative discussions that could possibly have an undesirable influence on preparations for the British referendum." An ORB poll for the Telegraph showed that support for Britain to stay in the EU stood at 51%, 5 points ahead of support for a withdrawal. "I think there are good reasons for Britain to remain in the EU," Steinmeier said, adding it was up to British voters to decide. "I'm only sure that if Britain decides to leave, that will initiate a negative dynamic in the rest of the EU." So it seems to me that he's made up his mind that we're not leaving and we're going to stay because it would make a negative impact on the rest of Europe. Well, they would just have to get on with it, wouldn't they? I mean, the rest of the world gets on without being part of Europe, so why shouldn't we get on well? That's why they're not making any plans for us to leave in Germany, because they've already decided we are going nowhere. And I think it's the Lisbon Treaty that says that all member states have to vote unanimously before any one member state can leave. That means that even if we vote to leave, well, that means absolutely nothing to the people who really run Europe, because they will all decide that we ain't going nowhere. So we won't be able to leave. We won't be allowed to leave. It's against their rules. It also brings into question the point of having a referendum at all. I mean, it's not like that on the 24th of June we're all of a sudden not going to be part of the EU. There's a question to ponder. Now, earlier on in this little piece, you heard me talk about how we would leave the EU, or how not, or how difficult it will be. Well, that all comes under Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union, which is the Lisbon Treaty. Article 50 of the Treaty of European Union, that's Lisbon Treaty, allows a member state to notify the EU of its withdrawal and obliges the EU to try to negotiate a withdrawal agreement with that state. It involves 5 points. 1. Any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. 2. A member state which decides to withdraw shall notify the European Council of its intention. In the light of the guidelines provided by the European Council, that's the Politburo of unelected officials who actually run things, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state, setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. That agreement shall be negotiated in accordance with Article 218 (3) of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It shall be concluded on behalf of the Union by the Council. Once again, this unelected Politburo of 28 unelected people, acting by a qualified majority after obtaining the consent of the European Parliament. So that's why I said earlier on that they all have to unanimously agree. 3. The treaties shall cease to apply to the state in question from the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement or, failing that, 2 years after the negotiation referred to in paragraph 2, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend this period. 4. For the purposes of paragraphs 2 and 3, the member of the European Council or of the Council representing the withdrawing member state shall not participate in the discussions of the European Council or in any decisions concerning it. Therefore, our representative of the 28 unelected will have to leave and isn't allowed to take part in the decision that's made about us. So the other 27 get to sit around and discuss us and decide what we can and can't do, and our representative is not allowed to have any say in any vote that is taken. A qualified majority shall be defined in accordance with Article 2383b of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. If a state which has withdrawn from the Union asks to rejoin, its request shall be subject to procedure referred to in Article 49. The form of any withdrawal agreement will depend on the negotiations, and there is therefore no guarantee the UK would find the terms acceptable. The EU treaties would cease to apply to the UK on the entry into force of a withdrawal agreement, or, if no new agreement is concluded after 2 years, unless there is a unanimous agreement to extend the negotiating period. During the 2-year negotiating period, EU laws would still apply to the UK. The UK would continue to participate in other EU business as normal, but it would not participate in internal EU discussions or decisions on its own withdrawal. On the EU side, the agreement would be negotiated by the European Commission following a mandate from EU ministers and concluded by EU governments, quote,